This station and other public television stations, the Mobil Corporation, Dow Chemical Company, John M. Olin Foundation, Incorporated, Laurel Foundation, Sunstrand Corporation, and the Friends of Firing Line.
It is always exciting when Thomas Sowell produces a new book, which means we live in exciting times, since he tends to do this quite often, 3 times in 1981, for instance. The Economics and Politics of Race, subtitled An International Perspective, asks most of the questions we are all asking ourselves about race and progress and politics. What sets Professor Sowell apart from many of his colleagues is that he sets down exactly what his researches indicate without any attempt to conform to fashionable political notions. Thomas Sowell was born in North Carolina and as a boy moved to New York. From high school in Harlem, he went to Harvard, where he took his first degree in economics. His second he took in Columbia, and his PhD at the University of Chicago. He went on to teach at UCLA, at Amherst, at Cornell, and since 1980 has resided as a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution, where during this period he has worked assiduously. His last 3 books were called Markets and Minorities, Ethnic America, and Pink and Brown People. Our examiner today is Professor Robert Cashman of Lehman College, about whom more in due course. I'd like to begin by asking Professor Sowell if he would tell us about shifting IQs and the relevance of this discovery.
Well, the controversy, of course, is over whether IQs are inherited or a result of the environment. And over time, IQs do shift. That is, as of the time of World War I, for example, the Jewish IQs were below the national average. And in fact, Carl Brigham, who was the author of the College Board SAT, said that this disproved the popular notion that the Jews were highly intelligent. As it turned out, he was somewhat premature, and a decade later, the Jews had higher than average IQs. In Japan, the average IQ has risen 7 points in the past generation. There's also data on black orphans raised by white families. Their average IQ is 106. So that the IQs are not set in concrete by any means.
Compared to what?
The national average of 100.
I see. Uh-huh.
And compared to an average IQ of 85 for black children as a whole. So they're not set in concrete, but neither are they irrelevant, because they measure skills that are very important in terms of mathematics, science, and many other intellectual areas. So they're not irrelevant, but neither are they set in concrete.
Let me read a sentence from your book, which I think grabs, at least grabbed this reader instantly. When you wrote, "The real question is what confluence of circumstances produced the fortunate conditions that a relatively small part of the human species enjoys today. To what extent can these peculiar combinations of historical circumstances be analyzed, recreated, or grafted onto other societies?" Now, you tell us that Jews came here and their IQ was at this level, and just a little bit later it rose to this level. This was the impact of America, right, on something you call human capital. Describe that, would you?
Well, the human capital is simply the whole range of skills, traits, discipline, even physical health that enable people to produce more than other people.
Inherited or learned, or both?
I guess it would have to be mostly learned, but I think, but almost inherited, in the sense that every generation raises the next generation. And so it's virtually the same as if it were inherited for most people. Very few people are in situations such as black orphans raised in white families. That happens very rarely.
Well, Professor Vandenhag quotes a study of zygotic twins in which one twin was raised in poor, austere circumstances, another in affluent circumstances, one made to go to school, one not made to go to school, but they ended up, roughly speaking, with the same IQ. This would not be the same as your research has indicated, would it?
Yeah, I don't know which study he's talking about, but I've looked at some of those twin studies, and unfortunately, some of those studies don't refer to twins that were raised in very different circumstances. And in fact, in some cases, they were raised in the same town by different relatives. There's a whole controversial literature on those twins, so I would have to know which studies he was talking about.
Well, to get back to the business of the accumulation of human capital is largely passive?
No. I think it's not necessarily a matter of individual merit in the sense that if you're born into a culture and into a family where there are certain values, and particularly if there are families that really insist upon those values, where it's not a matter of doing your own thing, then you will grow up with those values and you will have whatever the benefits happen to come along with those values.
You once told me that in your early days at Harvard, you had a very dramatic personal travail. You were either going to make it or not going to make it.
Yes.
And you shut yourself up and made yourself make it.
Yes.
In the absence of which, you would have been very different today from an esteemed
absolutely.
scholar. Now, what was it that gave you that strength? Was it something that you generated? Was it self-generating? Or was it something that, a resource that you inherited, or something that came in through the capillaries of the people who surrounded you at Harvard?
Oh, I suspect that by the time I got there, I was fairly well formed. I was 25 years old as a sophomore transfer student. It's hard to know. There were all those factors there if I were to look back, and I'm not sure that I'd be the person with the objectivity to say. Certainly having been through adversity before was some help, because I can remember a number of times in life when I faced tough things and I said, for God's sakes, I spent two months at Paris Island. You know?
What else is tough?
Yes, so you can't overcome that. I can remember once when I was dying to be a baseball player and I injured my right shoulder and I became left-handed for 2 years. So those things you draw upon later on. I think many people in trying to insulate young people from adversity, insulate them from the things that give them strength.
Okay, well now let's move on to the political implications of some of these points. One of them is a continuing war by you against the notion that affirmative action helps people, right?
Yes, but it's more than that. It's really a re-examination of the whole set of underlying assumptions, not only behind this program, but about social thinking in general. One of the things I wanted to deal with in this book, and the reason it's an international perspective, is whether or not a group is in fact formed by the society around it, or whether in fact the group has its own pattern, which follows it wherever it goes. Many people who criticized some of my earlier writings said that I arbitrarily attributed to groups characteristics that were really a function of the world they lived in the United States. And so I then looked at groups in other countries, the Germans in Brazil and Australia and Russia, the Chinese and Indonesia in the United States, other countries, to see, do they in fact have their own pattern, or are they simply reflecting what's happened to them in that particular country? And what I found by and large was that they had their own pattern, that the Germans in Australia specialize in very much the same kind of occupations and industries with the same kinds of skills, with the same kinds of, quote, stereotypes, unquote, about them as to their frugality, their hard working, their thoroughness, their honesty, law abiding, etc., that you find in the United States.
Well, but doesn't that contend a little bit with your notion that the culture is something you go piggyback on, for instance, when the Jews rose in their general level of IQ? Or is it a combination of bringing your own folkways, mores with you, but also getting on that which is dynamic in the culture you visit?
It's obviously both, as most things are in social causation. But many people came in when the Jews came in, and faced, for example, with the free public libraries, the free colleges of New York City, and so on. Many of these other groups never went near those things, or very seldom. Whereas the Jews, having a history in which learning had a certain place that it did not have in other cultures, it was like a gold mine to them. The minute they saw all of this, they seized upon it. At one time, not only were the Jews a majority at CCNY, they were 20% of the students at Fordham University, which is Catholic.
So that what you're saying is that there was something that catapulted them towards taking advantage of something that our culture provided.
Oh, absolutely.
Therefore, that permitted the ascendancy of their IQ.
Oh, yes.
Which would not have been the case if they had found themselves, say, in Brazil.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, in Israel, I understand that the Sephardic Jews who have been in the Arab countries for centuries have lower IQs than the Ashkenazic Jews who have been in Europe and the United States for centuries. So clearly the society has its impact. But it's also true that there are people facing exactly the same situation. For example, youngsters sitting side by side in the same classroom from different groups, living in the same neighborhood, and yet the IQ differences that you'll see will be as large as those among blacks and whites going to school on the opposite sides of town in Mississippi in the Jim Crow era.
Well, now, Ms. Sowell, the scare word in any discussion of race is, of course, the word genetic.
Yes.
Because too often people are delighted to affirm genetic differences, which allow for superior and inferior races and so on and so forth. Now, how, in fact, is one to distinguish between that which is genetic and that which is so impacted culturally that it might almost have that effect? You speak about the Ashkenazi Jews and the Sephardic Jews, and continuing differentials notwithstanding that the melting pot in Israel is now 40 years old. How do you account for that? And do you run the danger of the word genetic being used metaphorically to mean also hard cultural insisted inclinations?
I guess that my emphasis would of course be on the cultural. The Sephardic Jews, for example, who came to the United States and did not have these centuries in the Arab countries, are not at any disadvantage vis-a-vis Ashkenazic Jews in the United States. I think that's probably true in places like Brazil or Curacao as well. So it would be cultural primarily, at least in my judgment. Now there are those who would attribute it to genetics. I had an argument with someone like that last week. The great problem is these things go so much together that taking the black population of the Western Hemisphere, those blacks who have a higher percentage of white ancestry have had enormous social advantages historically. In the United States, when there was slavery, the overwhelming bulk of the slaves were black, but 37% of the free blacks were in fact mulattoes, which is in the American definition, half white or more. In Latin America, there are countries in which more than half of all the free blacks were in fact mulattoes, and in which the great majority of the slaves were black.
And advantages inured to them? Advantages inured to
Oh,
them?
absolutely, enormously. Well, freedom alone would be one big advantage. But even under slavery itself, there were distinctions made between the mulattoes and the blacks. The mulattoes being very often the offspring either of the slave owner or of the overseer, and therefore getting preferential treatment. And so throughout the Western Hemisphere, those people who have higher white ancestry among the black population have been economically, educationally, and otherwise more advanced. And in times past, it was quite common for them to attribute their success to genetics, when in fact they were fairly blatant historical differences. But the question is, how would you then separate out the two things, since they always occur together?
So that when Huey Newton went to Cuba and ended up complaining that all the privates were black and all the non-coms were mulattoes and all the generals were white, he was really making your point.
Absolutely. In fact, I'm amazed with all the way that the American performance in the Caribbean has been put under a microscope, that no one has noticed that those Cuban soldiers being brought back are black, and those Cubans who are running the country are white, and the Cubans who are appearing on television defending their country are likewise white.
Well, now, I think people read your book incorrectly who come to the following conclusion, but let me, in any event, state the conclusions they come to. Namely, that you oppose efforts, political efforts,